Good morning, everyone. This is JJ Evans here at the system office. I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules on your campuses and joining us for our conversation today. With us today, we have Ms. Jane Phillips, the HR director here at the system office, and that is her wonderful, lovely face you see on camera. And before I turn over the floor to her, I'd just like to say I'd like to thank her in advance for her time, and hopefully she can address some of the questions that I have been receiving in regards to the Fair Labor Standards Act that many of you have sent me emails and questions about. One thing I also like to say before we begin, I can't believe it's already Thanksgiving time, and so the semester has been running so fast, and so as always, I like to thank all of you for what you do for our campus, our students, and our system. And so thank you for all the hard work that you show and the work that you do. And with that, I will mute myself, turn it over to Ms. Phillips, and I will let her school us and inform us on all the changes that are coming forth fairly quickly. Ms. Phillips.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Feel free to type in any questions that you have, and I will try to address them as we go along. What we're going to talk about is the Fair Labor Standards Act, and I'm going to kind of walk you through the law and why and how that might impact the work that you do. So, the Fair Labor Standards Act is the basic federal law that deals with wage and hour. It was enacted back in the 30s during the Depression, and the goal of this was to eliminate the conditions detrimental to the maintenance of the minimum standard of living necessary for health, efficiency, and general well-being of workers. So this law has been in effect for a long time. It hasn't had a lot of major changes, but we're going to talk about today is kind of the basics of the law. And as always, you need to check with your supervisor, your administrator regarding any policies and procedures of how this is going to be applicable to your position and on your college campus. So the Fair Labor Standards Act does the following. It sets the minimum wage and the overtime rates for employees that they must receive. It has strict record-keeping requirements for employers, and it replaces the restrictions on the type of work that children can do and the hours that they can work, and it mandates equal pay for equal work. Now, it does not have anything to do with vacation, sick days, jury leave, jury duty, holidays, lunch breaks, coffee breaks, how often people must be paid, or restrict the number of hours that anybody over the age of 16 can work. Most of those types of issues are dealt with in other laws, other state laws, or other policies. So when you talk about this law, there's two categories. You're either subject to this law or you're not subject to this law. And the terms that most often people use are as you're exempt from the law or you're non-exempt or subject. And that refers to your status under the law. And what it means is that some parts of this law do not apply to you. So this is not a decision that is at a local level. It's not at a state level. There are federal tests to determine the status of positions. And these tests they actually measure the actual duties and responsibilities that the employee is doing, and it is not strictly based on a job title. So to determine whether you're subject or exempt from this law, there is a salary test and a duties test, and in most cases you have to meet both of those or you are subject to this law. So what is the difference? What difference does it make? So if you are non-exempt or subject to this law, you are covered by minimum wage requirements, overtime, and record-keeping requirements. If you are exempt, you are not covered by minimum wage, overtime, and certain record-keeping requirements. The law states that subject employees must be paid for all hours worked, and records must be kept of those hours. And we're going to talk a little bit about what constitutes work. And exempt employees, it basically means you can work whatever hours are necessary to get the job done. If that's 70 hours in a week, that's okay. You're not required to be paid overtime for that. So on college campuses, and pretty much in all agencies or all employers, There are tests for exemptions. And so what you typically hear about are the white collar exemptions. Those are for executive, administrative, and certain professional, which includes some of the computer related and outside sales. So you have to meet one of those duty tests, and we're not going to walk through all of those to be exempt, but you have to meet the duties test and the salary test to be exempt. Now, bona fide teachers and other academic personnel, and we'll give you the definitions of these in a minute, they are exempt from the salary test if they meet the duties test for bona fide teachers and academic personnel, but they must be paid at least the entry-level salary for teachers at the institution. So you have only one designation for an employer. So we have a lot of people on campuses that may work two jobs. So for example, you may have a full-time faculty member who is exempt because they're a bona fide teacher, who may have also a 10-hour a week helping in some other capacity that may be subject work. But that's okay because their primary designation would be exempt. Now, the opposite would not hold true. If you have someone who is in a subject position, a full-time subject position, they are subject to overtime, but then they may teach a class. Yes, the teaching of the class may be exempt, but if your primary duty is subject, you are going to be treated as subject all along. So any hours over 40 have to be paid at time and a half. So if you have a full-time 40-hour week that's subject and you teach one class, any work that for that teaching of the class has to be equal to at least time and a half pay. And that's where it gets very, very tricky. So for academic positions, these are the definitions that and the guidance that are provided by the Department of Labor. Teachers are not subject to the salary level requirement for the white collar exemption. They are exempt if their primary duty is teaching, tutoring, instructing, or lecturing. They include professors, adjunct instructors, and teachers of skilled and semi-skilled trades and occupations. For coaches and assistant coaches may fall under the exemption if their primary duty is teaching, which may include instructing of athletes on how to perform their sport. However, if their duties are primarily recruiting or doing manual labor, they would not be considered teaching, and therefore they would be considered subject to overtime. Now, a coach who has primary responsibility for instructing may also do some of those other things, but as long as their primary purpose and the bulk of their time is spent on the teaching of the athletes, they would be considered exempt. Now, other academic personnel that are used to run the institution, that are the ones that interact with the students, such as the department heads, those academic counselors and advisors, those with similar responsibilities are also exempt from the salary threshold, except they have to be paid at least the same as the entry-level teacher for their organizations. Now, other academic personnel that are primarily administrative, that would be dealing with financial sides or running of the institution on a business side or working with students more on a business side, they would not be exempt because they wouldn't meet that teacher type of exemption. Okay, so why are we even talking about this now if it came out in the 1930s? Well, President Obama tasked the Department of Labor with updating this back in 2014. They released the proposed regulations in 2015, and the final rule came out the beginning of summer. So the biggest change is the raising of the salary threshold for those exemption rules. And the goal of this was to do exactly that. It was to give more people protection under this law and the rights to overtime pay. So the final rule goes into effect December 1, so employers had 6 months to prepare, and they have to be compliant as of December 1, not figuring out what they're going to do. They have to already be in compliance as of December 1. So let's look at what changed. Currently, the salary threshold, if you met one of those duties tests, the salary threshold was $455 a week or $23,660 a year. If you met both of those, then you could be exempt under this law. The new threshold is considerably higher. It is $913 per week or $47,476 per year. And this was based on the 40th percentile of full-time salaried workers in the lowest paid census region, which is the South. And what this means is that in 3 years, they will update it based on what the 40th percentile of full-time salary workers are in the lowest census region, which is has traditionally been the South. So that is the biggest change. There was no changes to the um, jobs duties test. There's also a highly compensated workers test, and they did raise that salary threshold also, but we don't typically run into that on campuses. So faced with this, what can employers do? So remember, except for those bona fide teachers and those that are exempt from the salary piece, everyone else must meet both duties test and the salary test to be exempt, which means if they're currently exempt but they no longer meet the salary test, they must, under the law, be changed to subject. So that leaves employers with some options. So what can they do? They can recognize that someone is currently exempt and they're going to be changed to subject. They could pay them time and a half for overtime work. They had the option to raise their salary above the new threshold if they could. They can limit employees to working 40 hours per week, or what most are doing is some combination of the above. And it's important to note that as a government employer, colleges can award comp time at the rate of time and a half in lieu of paying overtime, but there are a lot of restrictions that go with that in terms of when the person can use it, how much can be carried forward, and such. So what does this practically mean? It means that a lot of people out there who are currently exempt are going to become non-exempt, and therefore they're subject to the overtime rules, which includes the requirement for paying overtime or the awarding of the comp time at time and a half, and requiring that timesheets be kept because there's the record keeping requirements. So on a campus, you may have people in the exact same type of position, and some are going to be subject and some are going to be exempt, and the law is okay with that. Most of our colleges do not have the money to increase salaries to keep the exempt status. And if you recall on the previous slide when we talked about how every 3 years they're going to look at the 40th percentile, you can expect that to go up, because if everyone were to raise everyone's salaries to the new limit, that's going to raise the average. And so in 3 years, that salary is going to go up even further. So it's going to be hard to keep above that curve. And of course, colleges probably don't have the money to pay the overtime either. So they have to balance that. So what we had talked to with we've been talking about this with the HR folks for the past probably about 2 years. And what we've recommended and what colleges have been doing is making sure their job descriptions are up to date. They had to identify those exempt employees whose salaries are below the limit, and they had to make some decisions. What would it cost to bring this salary up? And how much overtime does the person actually work? And there's actually, we send them out, there's a worksheet you can use where you can fill in what the person's salary is now and the cost of paying time and a half and how much overtime they would have to work for it to justify paying the higher salary. In some cases, the salaries are so far below that it's not even an option to try and bring them up. There's just not enough funding. And then you also have to look at wage compression issues. If we bring all these people up, what does that do with the people above them? Would they need to be raised? So there's a lot of work that's been looked at. They've had to look at their organizational structure to how to manage and structure these jobs. If we cut people back on their overtime, do we have enough staff to do the work? They have to do a lot of that figuring out of what's the best for their particular campus. Also, how are you going to communicate this and train to employers to understand the changes and to ensure that there's compliance? And we've got a slide in a little while where we'll talk about compliance issues. And then also reviewing that time and attendance process and workflows to ensure that you're compliant because of the record keeping requirements of the law. On the communication plan, what we've talked about is employees and supervisors need to sit down and talk about their job and where does overtime come in and how is that going to be handled. Because typically what you see in a policy is you must have approval to work overtime. Well, sometimes there are situations where you can't necessarily get approval. So what are those kinds of things? We encourage that communication happens up front so you understand that if it's 5 o'clock and you've got a student in crisis, and you need to stay with them, is it okay? Is that acceptable? Versus saying, I'm sorry, I get off at 5 o'clock and I can't help you. No one wants that to happen. So you need to sit down and have those discussions of say, these are the parameters that's allowed. These are the things that I want approval up front. So it really requires us to do a little thinking about how we do our jobs. So let's talk a little bit about what this word employ means. By definition in the statute, employ means to suffer or permit to work. And then we also have to look at the hours worked. Covered employees must be paid for all hours worked in a work week. So in general, hours worked include all time that the employee must be on duty or on the employer's premises or any other prescribed place of work from the beginning of the first principal activity of the workday to the end of the last principal work activity of the workday. And any additional time that is allowed, which is suffered or permitted to work. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide after this. So you first have to define and understand what your college work week is. Our work week here at the system office goes from Sunday through Saturday, and that's where we look at our 40 hours. So when it comes to this law, each work week stands alone. You look at 40 hours in that week, and that was how you determine overtime. So you can't average and say, well, I worked 45 hours this week and 35 the next week, so it averages. You still have to look at it within a work week basis. And the work day is that, again, that period of time on any particular day when an employee commences their principal activity and the day when they cease that. So it may be longer than their scheduled shift, hours, tour duty, or production line. It's based on what are we suffering and permitting to work. So work that's not requested but suffered or permitted is work time and must be counted. So here's a couple of examples that we talked about. I get off at 5 o'clock, but I have a student with me and I need to stay with them till 5:30 to resolve their issue. My supervisor told me I'm supposed to leave at 5, but if I worked and I was allowed to do this or permitted, it still worked. It's still considered work time and is compensable. Another example, an employee who eats lunch at their desk but continues to assist visitors and answer phones. This is considered work because they're not being relieved of duty. So those are the things that I said you need to talk about, sit down and have those conversations about how is my work, what is involved with my work, how are we going to handle this and these needs for when overtime pops up. The other thing that we talk about is waiting time. So if you're required to be there, it's considered work time. This is all from the law. So if people don't get the students or my meeting doesn't start till 8, but I'm required to be there at 7:30, then 7:30 is when the work time starts. This next bullet is one that comes up quite a bit. And these are those other types of things, lectures, meetings, conferences, training programs, all these other things that happen outside of the normal working time. So here is what the statute says in terms of when is it considered work. So it is always considered work unless these 4 things and all of them occur. So it would be outside normal work hours. It's voluntary, which means no adverse employment action if the person doesn't go. It's not job related to the current position, and no other work is being concurrently performed. So those are the things that unless all 4 of those are met, it's considered work. Now, sometimes you may be at a conference where most of that is considered work time. There may be a dinner. The dinner may be voluntary. It's not job related. It's outside the normal work hours, and you're not really doing anything else there except talking with folks. That may be a piece of that. You can say that's not work hours. But for the most part, all 4 of those would have to be met. When it comes to travel time, there's a lot of guidance out there with the Department of Labor that will spell what is considered. So when it comes to getting to work, I leave my house, I travel to the office. That's not work time. It's not compensable. Suppose I'm based in Raleigh, but I have a 1-day assignment. I need to go out to Craven Community College, and I need to drive to New Bern. So I normally work here. I'm given an assignment there. That time traveling is considered work time. Now you can deduct the time that it would normally take me to get to the office if that's applicable. Typically it's not, like it may be in some situations where you're driving further than you would to work, so you can deduct that time from travel to work, or it may be less, in which case you would count all the time as work. So then there's this, what they consider travel that's all in a day's work. So I'm based at the central location of my campus. I have to travel to another site, a satellite um, location on my campus. That is considered work time and must be counted as hours work if it's part of the job. Now, if I have two different jobs on campus and I finish my primary job on campus and then I have a night job that's totally separate, it's my voluntary decision, and I go and that's at another campus, that would not be, because that would fall under the whole I have to get to my work location travel. Travel that's away from the home community. So if you have to travel away overnight, say to a conference or to another college you're working at, that is considered work time. And it's considered not only on my regular work days, but if it's a Saturday or a Sunday and I'm having it. Now, as an enforcement policy, the division does not necessarily consider if you're just spent time traveling away as a passenger on an airplane, a train, a boat, a bus, or an automobile, if you're just a passenger, because you're not really working, you're maybe traveling, but you're really just sitting and traveling. So they would not consider that necessarily required to be documented as work time. So when it comes to looking at whether or not someone works overtime, it's based on that 40-hour work week and the time that's spent physically working over 40 hours, where leave that you take during the week may be counted towards your total hours of work, but it's not counted for overtime. So, for example, I take 8 hours of leave on Monday. On Tuesday, I work 10 hours. I still have not hit the overtime threshold because I haven't physically worked over 40 hours. My timesheet may say 42 hours, but in terms that would be just straight time or straight comp time. It would not necessarily kick me into the time and a half for overtime. It's still compensable, but it would not require that time and a half. So again, overtime is not automatically earned just for working more than your scheduled work day. It's the total of the hours worked in the day. So planning ahead can help offset that. So if you know that you've got something going on Monday and Tuesday that's going to require you to work overtime, you could offset that by working less hours later in the week. Again, this is all subject to supervisor approval and what your college policy and practice would be. So when it comes to record keeping, there are certain things that are required under the law that must be kept in terms of the employee's personal information, the name, home address, occupation, sex, birth date, if under 19 years of age, hour and day when work week begins, total hours worked, total daily or weekly straight times, any regular pay, any overtime pay, any deductions or addition to wages, total wages paid, and date and payment, and the pay period covered. Those are all required by the Fair Labor Standard Act for those who are subject employees. The issue comes in with compliance. It is going to be really hard for everyone, not just college employees, but remember, this is a law that's facing everyone in the country. We have a lot of people who are currently exempt or who are going to have to switch and become subject employees. So when it comes to compliance, you have to look at that work schedule. And it's going to be hard to stick to the 9 to 5 and not spend all night checking our emails and our cell phones. But all of that, again, falls back to that suffered and permitted. It counts as work time. So supervisors, we really have to talk with our employees to make sure that they understand the compliance. And wage and hour law is the one law where Department of Labor is very strict. They will come in and they will issue requirements for back pay if that work was suffered or permitted. So it's one of those things you really have to be careful about how you track. Again, a lot of campuses don't require exempt employees to keep timesheets. These employees now are going to be subject to that, just like our hourly employees, because that's the law. The biggest thing is that perceived loss of status. And again, we have to make sure employees understand that this was not a local college decision. This is a change at a national level in terms of this law. The biggest thing we have to avoid is that temptation to ignore it on behalf of either the employee or the supervisor, because again, this is federal law and we have to be very careful how we are in compliance with that. This presentation will be made available. And so you will have access to all of these slides. And I've put on here where you can read more. This law, like I said, has been around since the 30s. You don't really have to find the answer to any question. It's already out there for you somewhere. There's links here for the final rule. There's a handy reference guide on compliance. There's information for higher education. And then there's a fact sheet on those exemptions for professional employees. So all of that information is readily available. So that was what I had to present. Are there any questions? Okay, and JJ is going to unmute everyone. So if there's anyone who has a question, you can type it in or and I've included my contact information here at the system office. Feel free to give me a call if I can assist you, but I assure you your local HR staff can assist you also. We've been talking about this for, like I said, about 2 years now. The education exemption, I'm going back to that slide. These are the exemptions for academic positions. It has to fit one of those. Other than that, there is no education exemption. These are the exemptions that exist for academic. The question has to do with, in a nutshell, employees cannot volunteer time at their home institution. When it comes to volunteer time, there is a lot of guidance out there. It can only be volunteer time if the work that you are doing is only done by volunteers. So if it is work that other people are getting paid for, no, you cannot volunteer to do that. If you are a subject employee, it must be counted as work time. But if it is a job that only volunteers do, then yes, you can volunteer just like anyone else could. Not the question was, would most student life positions fall under? Typically, these are going to be the ones that are dealing with academics. There is guidance out there that says those that may be working with students, but not in that academic area, would not necessarily meet this exemption. So when you go to the guidance there for higher ed, you have to look at that. So for those who are helping them with, say, financial aid, that would not necessarily, because that's not academic, that is more administrative. So everyone that works with students would not necessarily fall under this exemption. Club advisors, would club advisors be considered as volunteers? Okay. Well, if they are currently in an exempt position and they're going to stay in an exempt position, they can work whatever they want and they can volunteer to do whatever they want because they're already exempt. A subject employee would have to look to see whether the work is work that is always done by volunteers or is done by paid employees. If the work is done by paid employees in other areas, then it must be counted as time worked. So it would depend on your campus how you handle those club advisors. But if it's done by a faculty member, they're already exempt, so they can do whatever. They can work however many hours they want. Any other questions?
Um, Someone said our club advisors aren't paid, and um, can you add the volunteer response to the slideshow?
Yes.
Some typing. I'm going to give you a few more seconds to flesh out your question. Any last minute questions for Ms. Phillips? If not, you do have her contact information, or feel free to send me any questions and I'll make sure I pass them along as needed.
And I will compile an additional list of resources and guides that you can look at that will address that volunteer issue and the other college positions on campus and how they would be looked at. And again, your HR staff would be the ones that you would want to talk with on that, to look at their particular institution and how they are evaluating positions.
Any last minute questions? If not, I'd like to thank you all for coming this morning. Definitely like to thank Ms. Phillips for her time and researching and putting this presentation together for us. I will, as always, make a copy of the recording, upload it to YouTube, and then I'll also share the presentation so you can refer back to it as needed. Just a few quick announcements. So State Board meeting is this Thursday and Friday. Make sure you all go look at some of those key State Board items for student life, and that will impact our corner of the world. Those can be found under both the Legislative and Finance Committee tab, so make sure you go look at those. Feel free to send any questions or concerns you may have, and I will try to get those answers as quickly as possible and get that information out to you as quickly as possible. Again, always thank you for everything you do, and if you have any additional questions, please let one of us know. And so thank you for your time this morning. I'm going to stop the recording in just 1 second.